Okay, welcome to today's event. I'm going to unpin and to give us all equal space because last week we didn't do that properly at all. So thanks everyone for coming. So we'll just go through our plan today is just to talk about beer again. Just have a chat about beer. And preferably about sours and where yeasts come into it and all of that. For anyone who wasn't here, there's a few things you can do. We're going to have lots of Q&A, hopefully, and we'll have you coming on. You'll see down at the end of the screen, there's a little hands up button. You can raise your hand and come up and ask us questions. Join in the chat. There'll be a couple of spot prizes for people who are brave enough to turn on their cameras and come and chat to us and take all the pressure off us. I have with me Mike from White Hag, Richard from Black Donkey, and I'm going to try and get Richard or Morris from Canvas up here now. So hopefully we'll all be online then. So as I said, the idea is just to keep it to an hour, keep it just a chat, nothing too focused, but hopefully it's not an interview thing. So everybody feel free to just talk over each other, and just if things come to mind, we'll just make it nice and casual. I'm hopeful Morris will be able to join us in a minute because he is here, and I can see him here, but I'm waiting for him to there. So the idea then today is we're just going to talk. The thing that all of you have in common really is yeast. You're all big into the wild yeasts, your own yeast. And I thought maybe it'd be interesting to kind of focus on that because I'm going to be hands up here now. I don't know huge amounts about brewing. I know just enough to know that I don't know very much, so I might be able to ask the questions and not get too carried away or too confident. But yeasts, I mean, obviously it's the live ingredient there. It's the thing that you probably have least control over. But is yeast, as I understand it, for commercial brewing for the past 100 odd years, they've been very isolated single strain yeasts in the commercial side. Right. Farmhouses were different. And it's only in recent times that kind of the wild yeasts have kind of come back into focus and, their influence and kind of up to this, the commercial brewers, the main brewers have been trying to almost take the kind of the variability of yeast out of it. Is that right? Would that be a fair summary?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's modern commercial industrial beer it's craft single slices of cheese pre-wrapped from the supermarket, or it's a hamburger from a fast food joint, or a sliced white loaf that could have been baked on the other side of the planet. Whereas what we do is blue cheese, it's dry aged steak, it's sourdough bread, and curiously enough, all three of those products are products that are produced through some sort of yeast fermentation. You don't think of steak as being fermented, but that's basically what's happening when it's being dry aged. Is you've got microbes working on the muscle and so on. And I have a friend of mine. He's a chef, an Argentinian chef, and he has a T-shirt that says "No garlic, no menu." And it just occurred to me that we should all be wearing T-shirts that say "No yeast, no beer." Yeah. You can brew without barley. You can brew without hops. Theoretically, you can brew without water if you're using a fruit juice to make wine, for example, but still the biggest component of fruit juice is water. But you can't brew without yeast. So without the yeast, there's no beer.
Right. Yeah. So, yes.
Oh, I was just going to say, like what Richard said, with the bigger breweries using that, trying to get yeast out of the equation, for them, it's all about consistency. It's all about putting out the exact same product every time, because that's what, people know and love from them, I guess. And they can't really afford to change that up. And yeast being the big unknown factor, if you will, in brewing, like they don't go too crazy with it.
And yeah, I mean, I remember like Carlsberg used to be promoting themselves as if it was a wonderful thing that they had this Carlsberg yeast that everybody used and that. But when they do that, I mean, yeast. Say Richard, I mean, you've isolated your own strain, and I know you have as well in White Hag, that you've got your own strain, you went out, you found it. when you kind of use that is presumably a mixture of different types of yeast all just piled together, and you're just kind of propagate that? Or no?
No. Well, in our case, the yeast we use that we first isolated in 2017 that we call Morrigan 1 is actually a pure strain. But it's we had it. So the yeast came from the skin of a blackberry that was growing in the mouth of a cave. And back in Irish mythology or Irish history, that cave was said to be the lair of the Morrigan, so that's how the yeast got its name. But if we had just taken the blackberry that it was growing on and put that into a solution and tried to ferment it, then we probably would have had a mixed culture fermentation. There could have been bacteria and other things involved. But what we wanted to do was isolate out a single yeast strain to see what it was capable of doing. So we did actually send the blackberry to a lab, and they isolated out the various microbes that were growing on the blackberry, selected one strain of yeast that tested for ethanol and carbon dioxide production, which is what we were looking for, and then sent that back to us. And we then started growing it up in wort solutions, and wort being the precursor of beer, if you will. And in fact, interestingly enough, from that area, we were there Halloween, so it was autumn time, and there's a blackberry bramble growing over the mouth of the cave, and there was also some St. John's wort and various other, Irish hedgerow stuff. And there was a fresh blackberry, there was a dried up brown looking one, and there was St. John's wort berries, and they were all probably within 2 meters of each other over the entrance to this cave. And I figured that the yeast we were looking for was most likely going to be on the skin of some sort of fruit. So I took those three and a bunch of other samples, but those 3 samples went to the lab, and each of those berries gave us a different strain of yeast, 2 of which are still in a freezer. Hopefully they're still in a freezer because it's a minus 80-degree freezer. Hopefully they haven't replaced it with COVID vaccine because, yeast is important. But anyway, those 2 other strains, when we did our first trials with them, they did something completely different flavor characteristics and that. We just haven't got around to working with them yet. So we'll see. Time, small brewery, we can only do so much at one time. But yeah, we're using a single culture for the Underworld series of beers.
And are yours the same, Mike? Is it at single?
No, so ours would be a mixture. When we got ours in 2016, I believe it was, we basically took some heather flowers out of a field and put them into the mash tun, the kettle, and then they put some into the fermenter as well. And we just let it do its thing. Naturally, it took a couple months for it to actually work for us. We just had it analyzed a year ago, I think it was. And I'm ashamed I don't have the paperwork here in front of me and don't remember exactly what it was, but it was a big mix of a bunch of different bacteria and things like that. So,
all right. Yeah, because I suppose everybody came familiar with yeast at this first lockdown. Everybody was doing sourdough everywhere. I know we had loads of sourdough bread here, but that was, again, I think I'd have to ask my wife, but I think it was just whatever was happening to be in the air or something became our bread.
Right.
Yeah, I think you get more complexity if you've got mixed cultures potentially. Your sourdough baking culture is almost certainly a mixed culture of bacteria and yeast. But yeah, I mean, it can go either way. I suppose we were being cautious with our wild yeast in that we didn't necessarily want to introduce bacteria into our workflow at that time, largely from a hygiene standard, a hygiene perspective. If you think yeast are invisible, so they can get into tiny little places and they can be hard to kill. But a yeast could, give a piggyback to 1,000 bacteria potentially. So they can really get into places that makes them almost impossible. They're not hard to kill. They're hard to get at. They're very good at hiding. So we, being somewhat cautious, decided that we wanted to bring yeast in, not bacteria. If we do choose to brew with bacteria down the road, it'll be a conscious decision, not an accidental one. So that's why we got the lab involved.
Yeah.
Well, at least saying that, I hope it'll be a conscious decision. Nature has its way,
Yeah. Yeah. We were a little less cautious, I think, which is, I think, the first time. Like, so I started here in 2000 and middle 2016 it was, and when I first heard that we were doing sours, I was kind of blown away because you know, back in America where I'm from, a lot of breweries are terrified to do it because they're terrified of infecting all their brew house equipment and constantly getting that bacteria into other beers, because like Richard said, it can hide anywhere, and you know, it's easy to kill, but it's hard to find. So when I first saw that we were doing sour beers here, I was kind of mind blown, but it is a little bit scary because, you know, you can get infections and you can get it in other beers and things that you're brewing. We don't have a separate facility for our sours. We just have to be really careful about our cleaning processes. Like, we have a very strict cleaning process after we use Brett or our house sour culture or anything like that. So,
okay, yeah, and I suppose the other thing, maybe just because we're talking about sours, maybe if we want to pick one of, who wants to start with theirs? We start with Mike with yours. Or no, you've got
yeah. You guys can say you got yours there, don't you?
Yeah. So I mean, just taking that one, that's, you know, you've mixed that in. Obviously, you've made it extra sour, I think, because you've added lemon or something. Have you?
Yeah. So I've got it right here. So like I was saying, the yeast for that is actually also the same yeast. It's our only house sour yeast, but this is a Heather bottle. It's the only one I could actually find in the brewery right now from Hagstravaganza 3 there. That was just our barrel-aged beer of the year there. Like, every year for Hagstravaganza, we would do a different barrel-aged beer. But so that the yeast that's in the sour there that we got from the Heather flowers, we use that also in the Púca here. And so for the Púca, we decided to go with lemon and a low ABV, kind of just make it a little bit more sessionable, a little bit easier to drink. And it is definitely a little bit more sour because of that lemon. We used 10 kilos of fresh lemon in there, along with a little bit of coriander. Coriander just to kind of give it a little bit of complexity, because in a fairly like lower ABV beer, you know, we didn't want it to be just super plain and simple. We wanted to just give it a little bit of complexity, like I said. Yeah. So, and this will naturally, with our sour culture, this goes down to about 3.2 is our final pH every time across the board, which is really handy that we don't have to do anything extra or anything special with it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, what's your impression of it, Richard?
I think it's lovely, to be honest with you. I will be perfectly upfront and say 9 out of 10 times when I see sour written on a beer, I won't even consider it, because there was a crop of kettle sours. I think the phase has kind of died out a little bit now. But when sour, it takes a lot of work and effort and not inconsiderable risk to produce a proper sour beer. But you can also cheat effectively by throwing a pot of yogurt into your wort and letting it sit overnight at a stable temperature, and it sours the lactobacillus in the yogurt. If it's live, will sour the wort, and then you boil it to kill all those bacteria and ferment it out as normal beer. But 9 out of 10 of them are like drinking out of a battery. I mean, they're just a flatline, acidic, sour, you know.
Metallic.
It's a shortcut to something that you shouldn't be taking shortcuts to.
Right.
And then people fire tons of fruit into them and purees and this, that, and the other thing. And sometimes they just taste like sour fruit, but they don't have any character. But this has character. I mean, you can taste it's a mixed culture. You can taste it's been a long ferment. You can taste the lemon. It's got that lovely lemon zesty kind of character. I think this is one of the sours. This and the hibiscus one, the pink can. I do like both of those beers a lot. And I like sour beers when they're not blanket. Obviously, there's always going to be good, bad, and otherwise. But I like proper sour beers, but kettle sours, which people were calling Berliner Weiss, which is not entirely accurate. I don't much care for them. They're kind of flatline, you know.
Yeah,
homebrewers gone wild.
Yeah, I see a question over here in the comments. I guess a couple of them actually. Does using your own non-standard yeast mean that canning bottling companies are working with you? Yeah, definitely. Yeah. We were working with Irish craft canners there for a while, and they were not happy to do any of our sours in cans and things like that. But now we've kind of got our own canning line, so we don't have to worry about it, I guess.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing. If people are curious why we don't can, there's two reasons. One of them is when we set up, we spent a not inconsiderable amount of money on a bottling line. And the other reason is the contract canners are very reluctant to put anything other than standard kind of bread and butter brewing yeasts through their system for fear of contamination. Like Mike said, they have a very strict cleaning regime up there, as do we. We basically pasteurize our kit. We give it a rinse and try and maintain the kit at 85 degrees so that hopefully any little nasties are dead. But I know, speaking of the guys at the canning company, one of their mobile canning lines, maximum temperature they can put through it is 65 degrees. And at 65 degrees, you're not killing stuff, you're just tickling it. So, you're relying on the chemicals to do their work. And so consequently, they're a little hesitant to do anything other than, standard kind of yeasts.
Right.
So I've got Richard here. Richard, do you want to turn on your camera or your mic there? And that's
Hey, James.
Hey guys, how's it going? Good to see you. Richard, it was just for you when you were talking about finding the yeast strain. Has that affected the flavor? If I was picking up a sheep stealer that I still have from 2016 or whatever, 2015, would I taste a difference in the new releases?
Well, I would say if you have a sheep stealer from 2015, it's probably not going to taste like it did when it was bottled. I'm not going to say it's going to be worse. We actually look forward to culling our sort of control samples in the brewery when we have older beers, because 9 out of 10 times they've developed favorably from the time they were bottled. But we don't actually use the new strain on sheep stealer. So sheep stealer remains as it always was. It's fermented with a commercially available Saison yeast. The objective with the wild yeast chase, as we called it, was in answer to the question, why are we brewing Belgian style beers as an Irish brewery? The sort of missing link between Belgian brewing and what I perceived to be traditional Irish brewing was that we didn't have yeast strains that would produce the characteristics that Belgian yeasts do. So when I went out looking for the yeast, I wanted to find a native Irish diastatic strain that would produce a similar character to the commercial Belgian diastatic strain. And so all the beers brewed with that yeast, our house yeast Morrigan, are in the Underworld series, so called because of where the yeast came from. But
right, okay.
That said, last year being what it was, we kind of shelved Underworld to focus on the core beers that were selling in 2020 volume anyway, and potentially able to keep the lights on and the rent paid. And too much in the way of, we did a bit of experimentation, kind of off grid, if you will, not for public consumption. And the Underworld series is coming back, big, bad, bold, different branding. For the first time in our history, I'm actually paying somebody else to do a label. Me and Illustrator, we've reached our zenith, and I just don't want to be sitting in front of it anymore. So,
fair enough. Thanks very much.
So yeah, I hope to be able to release a whole new series of Underworld beers later this year, or at least to be 3 to begin with, all of which are going to be fermented with wild native Irish yeast.
All right, James, thanks for asking the question. As the first person up and brave enough, I think Rich would be proud to give him the T-shirt.
Oh, I think so. Yeah, I think we can do that.
I think we can do.
Thank you very much,
or James, and we can send We send you a T-shirt out, and anybody else, you get the next few people get T-shirts as well if you're brave enough to do what James did and come up and take part. And we have Morris has joined us as well. I see from ploughing down in Tipperary.
You say you're in a tractor, Moss.
Yeah, I'm in a tractor, which is a little bit of a challenge in terms of connecting in, but we got there.
Park under the HT cables.
Yeah. But yeah, no, it's lovely weather. So as in that's so yeah, hi everyone, I'm Moss from Canvas Brewery. So we are a farm brewery, I suppose is what you'd say, and we can talk about farmhouse beer versus farmhouse breweries. They're slightly different. But because it's good weather, it is time to start sowing the spring barley, which is all malting barley, which we'll eventually go and make beer. Basically, we'll harvest it in autumn, and it will be stored, and then some of it will be malted ourselves, and some of it will be malted commercially, basically. So that's why when there's good weather, you'll see our farmers running for the tractors and getting out of inside. So
holding up traffic.
I'm not quite sure. I was trying to debate whether I would be able to multitask this as to whether I'd be able to plow away, just kind of keep a little eye on and just be like, yeah, I don't mind that. I'm just hammering a rock out of here. And don't worry. But I decided against it. I've turned off the engine.
It would have made an interesting kind of feature anyway. But at least we made it anyway. I thought we weren't going to do it there for a while. You just missed the start. We were just talking about generally yeasts in general and just how the strains have gone from being very single. I suppose it's kind of been more than a handful in use around the world commercially for a while. Was there? That kind of
depends who you ask.
Yeah, and what I'm interested as well is we're a farm brewery, but what we're trying to do as well is to move towards more of our own yeast, basically. So I guess in that beer, the Liminal, that is fermented with basically our first beer that we put in an oak barrel. We would have added commercial yeast to it, USO5, but basically other yeasts were in the barrel as well. So basically after 6 months, that beer started to develop more flavor, and we were like, oh, hello, something else is in there. And since then, we've repitched that yeast into the next barrels, basically. And that means that it's got a little bit of commercial yeast in there, but it's also got this other stuff from the barrels. And that's what a longer term where I want to go is basically to be brewing with our own yeast strains. And the single versus multiple, I'd be more towards brewing with multiple yeasts. It's more mixed fermentation, basically, to get more complexity and to kind of get away from this. In terms of agriculture, monoculture isn't good. And in terms of beer, I'm like, can we get multiple strains in there to produce nice flavors? Which is more complex, but I think more nuanced.
Yeah. Actually, that's something that I just been thinking about because I've been trying to read up on stuff this week. And what I think was Richard said there about that we didn't have really native Irish yeasts. I mean, obviously they existed in the wild, but no one used them for brewing. But I mean, we didn't really have, when I started thinking about it, we don't really have kind of a farmhouse brewing culture because we just didn't have big, colonialism and all that. There weren't farms to actually do that.
Well, I would blame that not on colonialism. I'd blame that on a big stout producer who systematically bought up breweries and shut them down.
You saw what happened in Japan after the earthquake there a few years ago. The same thing happened here, only the tsunami was black and it literally wiped the map.
Right.
Yeah.
About 200 years ago, I suppose. And curiously enough, it happened. It coincided with the development of the railways. And all of a sudden, that black tide was able to spread out from the Pale and just sweep everything before it. There was hundreds of breweries in Ireland back in the day. And back in those days, there was no microbiologist, so they didn't know about yeast. So every brewery would have had its own strain of yeast. It would have known that the beer coming from Moss's brewery tastes this way and from Mike's brewery tastes this way. And they'd all be different characters. And that's kind of what we were aiming to find, was what was likely to have been fermenting beer in this part of the world before the advent of sanitation and microbiology and, this and that. And yeah, probably would have been mixed cultures almost certainly. But initially, probably a dominant single strain of yeast would have done the bulk of the work. And then given time, the secondary strains come in and start doing their sort of cleaning up, if you will. And that cleaning up leaves character behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd add to that in that the canals as well, the trains and the canals. So the canals brought the grain. The idea, when they first came in, the idea was the canals could move heavy goods much further, and that could move the grain around. And the idea, the brewers, regional brewers thought this is great. We can bring our beer and sell it into Dublin. What actually happened was the economies of scale of larger breweries in the city, the big one producing stout, got more cheaper beer into the local towns, and that system over time shut them down basically. Which interestingly, my dad can remember selling grain to Boland's Mill in Dublin, which was delivered on a barge.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's not that long ago.
Horse-drawn barge?
Probably had an engine in it, to be fair. But if there's American tourists here, it'd be a horse-drawn, right? The other one is that Guinness have this catalogue of like over 200 yeast strains. So every brewery that they bought over, they would have taken their yeast strain and catalogued it, which is supposedly they're... Actually, I'm not going to talk about them. They just get me annoyed when I say something fucking...
It's like Voldemort. If you say it too often, they'll appear.
Yeah, and we're talking about craft. It's a different thing.
Right.
But yeah, no, and to me, yeast is very much what can drive so much flavor in beer and give, not just the raw ingredients, which I'm shooting myself in the foot because I'm all about the raw ingredients of the barley that we grow in our own fields, but the yeast is such a big character, and that's in terms of if everyone is brewing yeast with USO5, how much different is it? And I would go further and say if everyone's brewing with Weyermann's and USO5, okay, now there's process differences, yes, and that depends how every brewer chooses how to brew their thing. But to drive real variation and interest, I think we do need to go and have different yeasts and have, our own yeast strains.
Don't forget the water.
Oh yes. Water chemistry is also obviously I'm like.
Well, let's stick to we claim the yeast for now. But actually, that's a question. Why is it that, I suppose it's just the way that they pick that most yeasts, the wild yeast, you associate wild yeast with sour, but why is it that it's always more sour? Is it just that the commercial strains were just picked and selected to take out sourness, or?
I suspect to a large extent the commercial yeast are selected to not upset anybody, to be as mass acceptable as possible. In the same way that, like I mentioned before, a big slab of nice runny ripe blue gorgonzola versus a craft easy single. The easy single is going to please more people than the gorgonzola, and more people will be willing to try something that looks like it came out of a factory rather than something that looks like it came out of a shed.
Right.
And I think, that's just sort of flatline it. So try and please all the people all the time, which you will never be able to do. But if you kind of flatline it, you'll be able to please more of them than if you go off the reservation.
Yeah. And if you haven't experienced it, then that's what you have so that's your palate. That's what people are used to. So
arguably all these yeasts started out as wild. One thing I will say is at one point in time we looked about going down the organic route brewing wise and decided against it in the end for a host of reasons. But there was talk about getting organic certification, and the yeast would have to be certified as organic. And I said, it's flipping yeast. Of course it's flipping organic. And a bit further research turned out that in other industries that use yeast, baking in particular, some of their yeast strains are GMO'd up the yin-yang. I mean, they're about as far from something that came out of the sky as, an industrial product. But in brewing, globally, we still do respect the yeast to the extent that even though big labs and the big breweries, they constantly select the healthiest cells to reproduce and reproduce them under optimum conditions. They haven't been genetically engineered to be anything other than what they were back in the old days. They've been selected for flavor characteristics and turnaround times and flocculation and all that kind of thing, but they are still effectively natural organisms.
Okay. Well, since
the other thing I would comment on is Kvaik and the Norwegian farmhouse thing. Like that's cool stuff if you want to go on a rabbit hole and learn about farmhouse brewing. But they would have handed down their yeast from brewer to brewer, and genetically it's quite different, going back a good few like 800 years or something. But it's farmhouse yeast doesn't have to be sour. Or, you know what I mean? As in, selecting your own yeast, we're mostly talking about Saccharomyces, right? As in, so Saccharomyces is brewer's yeast, generally. Brettanomyces is a different type. People would sometimes call that wild yeast. But then you've got Pediococcus, and Lactobacillus would be one of the souring yeast, or bacteria. So, like, it's a lot of times people think kind of wild, they think automatically sour. But just because it's wild or you've collected it from a wild, it can be still Saccharomyces producing conventional beer. It depends now if you start to add in Lactobacillus and your Pediococcus and other guys to produce more sourness to it, And that's, you can use wild yeast to produce conventional beer that's not sour at all. Producing sour beer then is the next sort of thing, And so, like, even the Liminal that beer there, from barrel 26, that's not particularly sour. It's, there we go. Yeah, I don't have one in my back pocket on the tractor. It turns out.
And furrows need to be nice and parallel.
Yeah. God, lads, it's so funny, but like, it does actually. I can see where the ploughing championship comes from, because it's like might just straighten that up another little bit. It's like, does it make any effect to the growing grain? No, but like, we want to have it nice and straight.
But yeah, Moss is 100%. It's I get feedback all the time. Our Underworld series, for example, it's not particularly sour. It's not, in terms of empirical measurement, the pH of the finished beer is no different than most run of the mill beer, most normal non-sour beers. Let's say it doesn't finish down at 3 point something or other, and I get feedback from people going, "This isn't sour. Well, it's not supposed to be sour." Yeah. And then the next feedback will be, "Oh my God, it's so sour, I can't drink more than one of these." So I think a lot of it comes down to perception as well. Like, if you just ate a candy floss and then you drank an Underworld, it's going to taste pretty sour because your mouth is loaded with sugar. Conversely, if you drank, I haven't tried the Liminal yet, but if you drank a Púca lemon sour and then you drank Cheap Stealer or an Underworld, it might actually taste sweet to you. A lot of people, Cheap Stealer is a diastatic Saison style beer, and it has, by brewery measures, it has 0 fermentable sugar left in it at time of packaging. And, should correct that, after it's done its secondary fermentation in the bottle, it's 0 detectable sugar left, same specific gravity as water. And yet there is a perception of sweetness in the beer, and people go, "Oh my God, it's so sweet, I can't drink too much of it." And it's actually not sweet. It's just that 10% of the beer is sweet, 90% of it is dry as a camel's you know what. So that little bit of residual sweetness in there gives a perception of something quite sweet, but it's really not sweet at all. It's perception. It's down to the palate.
Yeah, and that's the different compounds that can actually produce different flavors. You know, like as in you can have a compound that can appear sweet, even though that's dry as a bone, which actually is a great beer. I was very much enjoyed it during the week. I did taste these beers before today. But I love those sorts of dry beers that have flavor and have those compounds in there. Like that's. And like even say the Liminal, I purposely haven't said sour on it because it's not sour. Do you know?
Yeah, it's not. No,
it's not sour. No, it's more acidic.
Beautiful. Like
it's tart, but I wouldn't call it sour.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
I get a nice little oak flavor off of that as well. Yeah. Like it's beautiful.
Well, that's 12 months plus in red wine oak barrels, so it's
12 months.
Jeez,
yeah.
There's almost a bit of cocoa in there too. It's like chocolatey note. Yeah, very nice.
Yeah, gorgeous beer.
Just a matter of interest. Do you have a small canning machine down there, Moss? Or are you getting somebody in to do the canning for you?
They said, no hell will they touch us with all the wild yeast that we have floating around.
Yeah.
But no, we're canning ourselves inside with a manual canner. And we're doing it a barrel at a time. So basically, minimum, the other guys would want 1,000 liters. So we're a labor of love, basically, that, there's 500. And that's the idea of putting the barrel number on the beer, is that, there's more liminals, but they're just from slightly different barrels and slightly different yeasts within each barrel. So it's like, it's the same beer. It's the same base beer, but it's got a little bit of nuance depending on where it is. So that's because we're bottling or canning. I keep saying bottling because we used to do all bottles. Because we're canning one barrel at a time, each one is slightly different. And that's the idea. We're trying to celebrate variation as opposed to macro don't say the word stout. That's all consistent and the same.
Yeah. And are you doing your primary fermentation in stainless, or are you going straight from your kettle to barrels?
Straight into barrels with these ones.
Right.
So we do some stainless, but these ones are fermented and aged in barrels. Just out of simplicity, basically.
Yeah.
So it's very much old world, That's.
I have a question here actually from Ronan down in Blackstone Kinsale. He's wondering why you're doing cans instead of bottles.
Good question. Transport is one, because we've started delivering beers directly to people, and that's a plug somewhere on the website. You can find a shop that does that. But
I was going to say, is it 3 letters, DPD?
No, Fastway actually.
Oh, Jesus. Fastway actually busted a keg on me. I wouldn't trust him with a bottle. I would only go even trust him with a can.
Busted a keg, that's impressive. So basically bottles end up coming back to you and you're like, all right, okay, I'll send another box and see if this gets it. Whereas cans don't. And they're lighter. Like fundamentally, they're so much lighter. And sustainability is a huge thing. That we are a wood-fired brewery, so we have a wood-fired boil kettle. We malt on site, and that's wood-fired. We have an Archimedes screw generating electricity, so we're trying to get sustainable and sourcing everything from inside. And fundamentally, we can't make cans or glass bottles, but cans are lighter, and basically you have less greenhouse gases associated with the lighter package. I
was last week about cans, and are you surprised that there's actually a demand? It seems to be, it can suit the brewers generally, I suppose, for the reasons you said, but that there's a demand from the public seems to be for cans more. I'm still surprised at that.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of the off-license and distributors, Maurice, I think it's like a lot of the off-license and shops and things, it's easier for them to store it as well. Like, you can fit more cans on a shelf than you can bottles, things like that. It's better for the pubs to have more refrigerator space and things like that. So.
Yeah, no, but I can see it from the industry point of view, but it does seem to be a thing that you see people get excited when they see a beer appears in a can.
Customer point of view, this because we've just recently, Christmas was the first time we had beers in cans. And customer point of view, I was a little bit unsure as to what would happen. And actually I gave some samples to a German guy. So I was like, he's going to be very like ultra, this should be in a bottle. And he was just like, nope, that's great. I was just like, so it depends on the person and what their perception of a product is. Do you know what I mean? That like, I've been surprised with people saying, yeah, cans are perfect. I love it. And from the customer point of view, I've noticed it myself. You can basically crush the can, chuck it in the recycling bin, job done. You don't feel like an absolute alcoholic going clink, clink. See, they're not all me. They're not all me. There's lots of people as well.
See, I got to say though, that's one of my. Now I have nothing against the can as a vessel for the storage of beer. In fact, back in 2013, I priced a canning line instead of a bottling line initially, and I was basically laughed out of it by all and sundry. And they're like, you can't put craft beer in cans in Ireland; it'll never sell. But they shouldn't have listened, because they're the same people who said a Saison will never sell in Ireland. But to go off on a slight tangent, cans versus bottles, the CO2 footprint of the two packages is open to debate, and I do tend to fall on the glass side of the argument. But what is not open to debate around here, even remotely, is in a small village I live in, we have 4 bottle banks for clear, green, brown, blue, whatever color glass. We have no can banks. So every fucking ditch in the county has been turned into a can bank.
Yeah.
Sons of bitches who won't frickin' pay for a waste disposal are just literally firing black bin bags full of cans. And 9 out of 10 times it's the 99-cent lager cans into the fucking ditches. And it drives me up the wall.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, I think if we're going to promote cans as a vessel, we also need to promote can disposal that doesn't cost people money.
Yeah.
No, there is money in cans. You go to a major metropolitan area and you see people collecting cans out of bins to sell them to the recycling places.
Oh, and hey, the recycling places are making money on recycling aluminium cans. Like, that's not free. Like, they're making money on that. My experience was I spent a good bit of time in Africa doing work in sustainability, but they had a whole system where glass bottles are recycled. You paid a deposit when you buy any beverage. You paid a deposit for the glass, and you got that deposit back when you handed it back. So you just swap it forward and back, and it was amazing. Like, everywhere, like everyone would be like, "Oh, you go for a thing of Coke," and they'd be like, "Oh, here, I've got an empty here. Hand that back, and you'll get." I was like, "Oh, cool," and you could just see, this is like 4 years ago, cans were beginning to come into supermarkets, and you could start to see the rubbish proliferating. And I was like, lads, you have a whole system. It's cheap as chips. Like, why are you doing this getting into this disposable crap? Whereas, like, and in Europe, it's you pay a deposit for the glass, it goes back to the brewery and it gets reused. Like, that's my ultimate. I'm not ruling out glass, and I do like glass as a package as well. I'm still debating it in my head, but that's the ultimate, is when the bottles go back go back to the brewery, refill them through a machine, scan them, clean them, everything, and off you go. Like, that would be A1, and that's glass. Aluminium can't beat that, you know.
Yeah,
but we're a distance away from doing that sort of stuff. We can't even have an aluminium bin. Never mind having recycling that it goes back to the brewery. You know.
Yeah. No, because that's what you see in places like, say, Belgium. All the supermarkets have a place you go, you put the bottles back in there and get your some ticket that you can convert for money.
There is talk about a deposit return scheme coming in Ireland. I'm actually hoping it doesn't include glass. But plastic and cans. I think from our perspective, the way it's being drawn up by the major drinks producers, there are caveats or there are conditions being put in there that would potentially make every small canning or bottling line in the country obsolete.
Oh, I'm sure they'd be quite happy to keep the rules that way as well.
Yeah,
they'd only love if we all disappeared and stopped trying to flood the market with craft beer that actually creates more jobs and creates more value and keeps money local and does all the interesting things, gives people choice, you know.
Yeah,
it's not flooding yet, so they're not but yeah, getting there hopefully. Just talk. I mean, Richard, we were just talking about the Liminal there, so that's. I mean, sorry, before we get on to Richard. So the Liminal is more what serves me more as like a Flemish red type of ale, is it? It's rather than kind of a pure sour.
You're talking to me or Moss?
I'm talking to Moss. I was starting to talk to you, and then I thought I'd better close off the thing about the Liminal first.
Go on, Richard. You can describe the beer. I'll see what. Would you guys agree with Flemish red on it, or red brown? Should it be more sour?
I would say, yeah, Flemish red. I would expect more sourness.
Yeah.
I would think.
I don't know, actually. Like, because I've had other Flemish reds that are, on that same level. Like, I think
carbonation is probably a bit low as well.
Yeah.
But then again, I like spritzy beers. I like high carbonation. That's kind of my thing.
I'm too used to tasting beers from the barrel that I'm just like, doesn't need any carbonation. This is perfect.
Yeah.
It's flavored.
I like the lower end of carbonation for sure. Like, I think it's easier on me.
But Saison though would be, as in, like, some of the Belgians would be pretty high effervescence. That would be.
But you want it in those kind of beers though, like.
Yeah.
And Richard, the sheep sealer, you're describing it Saison. I know that kind of covers a whole gamut of things. So,
well, curiously enough, as a direct result of market research, long story short, I lived in New York for 20 years, and one of the last things I did before I came home was brew a keg of what became Sheep Stealer, and it went into a container, and it came across the Atlantic with all the, the household possessions. And when that container arrived on the boreen outside here, it was kind of like, don't need a couch, don't need a kitchen. Oh, where's my keg? And dug through and found the keg. And when I went round, when I was setting up the brewery, and I went round and visited the breweries that were about the country at the time, and the universal question was, what are you going to launch with? And I said, a Saison. And the universal response was, yeah, good luck. So largely as a result of that, and it's a question I answer frequently, is it doesn't say Saison on the Sheep Stealer label. It says Irish Farmhouse Ale, because I thought that might be a little more approachable than Saison. Saison might just be a step too far. We've come leaps and bounds in the last 7 years. I mean, 2014 to now, it was a different world in terms of beer in Ireland. And it was, I got turned on to Saison when I was brewing in New York, and it just struck me that the Saison, in terms of versatility, the blanket way I describe it, certainly our Saison, because it is a very broad encompassing kind of term. People say, what's it like? I say, it's what lager wants to be when it grows up. And it's every bit that approachable, but the versatility in it. And I love to eat. I've always liked to eat. I hunt, I fish. I don't forage much anymore, but I used to. And food is very, very important to me. And, for the longest time, I've said we have some of the best ingredients in the world. For the longest time, we also didn't know how to prepare them, but that's changed. We now have some of the best chefs and restaurants and all that. Our food game is top class, but our drinks game hasn't kept up, certainly not our domestic drinks game. And so I decided I wanted to brew a Saison, because I think as far as food accompanying beers go, Saison or beers within that class are probably the most versatile there are. There are certain things, some beers pair better with some sweet foods and desserts and that kind of thing, but variations on the Saison style will pair with damn near anything, and also be very approachable to non-overly adventurous drinkers, I think. So that's kind of what I wanted to do. I want to see Ireland's beer, domestic craft beer, taking some market share from imported wine. We can only do so much against the big breweries, but I think where we have a lot of ground to gain is in the wine market.
Yeah, and I would agree on the good food, as in a good beer paired with the right dish is such a great combination. That like you can get the flavors. Yeah. Red, you've got white and red wine, right? As in, okay, you can match within a certain degree, but beer, you got Saison, you got stouts, you've got such a range of different flavors, intensity, strengths, that you can do an awful lot. But that's something I'd love to do. Is, well, restaurants are closed, right? But like, have more of that beer being acceptable on a restaurant table, paired beside good food, because it's a great combination between two things. And I think the Saison, sorry, not using the term Saison on the Sheep Stealer, as in, I think that is a big thing. I've noticed it with people as well, like, because, and even with the Liminal, I don't say the word sour because it's not sour enough, but also people I've served that to like neighboring farmers when they call in, and harvest is like, here, have a little taste of that, and they're just like, geez, that's great, and they would not be craft beer drinkers, but when they taste it, they're just like, geez, that's something. What is it? I'm like, it's an amber ale, like, oh yeah, grand, I love that, and it's like, and they're like, oh, it's fruity, and it's, and I'm like, yeah, you wouldn't have tasted this if it was a craft beer and it said Saison or these scary words that I don't know, but you actually really like that flavor, so have a try of it, have it, and then you're like, geez, I really like that, and work from there. So yeah, I'm toying with putting less information on our beers that way, and just be like, try it, and like, don't be judging it before you've actually tasted it. See what
Yeah.
Richard, I got a question for you real quick. Is there a reason you went with the 500 ml bottle and not like a 330 or?
Well, if you'll bear with me 1 second.
Yeah.
that's an Irish thing, I would say. As in, a lot of people would say we're all 330s, and people are like, no, 500 is what works. You know, there's a perception of value in the 500.
Yeah, you can't
in the
buy
Irish
that in the
market.
unless you cross an ocean. You can't buy that in the shops here.
All right.
We do 330s, but almost exclusively for export. We have some restaurant customers for them, or we had some restaurant customers for them. Hopefully we'll have them again. But yeah, the 500, it's the standard in Ireland, and anything less is not seen as being a serious drink. Unfortunately, I personally prefer the 330s. I don't like filling them. It's a lot more freaking labor filling them.
Yeah.
But as a you know, it's sort of day is done. You're sitting home. You've had your dinner. You got that half hour on the couch between 10:30 and 11, and you want a drink, and that's a good drink for a Tuesday. Whereas you get into a 500, by the time you finish the 500, you're kind of going, I don't have to be up until 6. You know, maybe I get another one in.
Yeah.
So
I
was just going to say
I agree that
in most of the world, that's the standard. The 500 is England, Ireland, maybe Germany, certain styles in Germany, but most of the rest of the world, they prefer their beer in smaller doses.
Yeah, I mean, you see some of them down as low as 25,
you
know, or 250.
I know, that's just being stingy.
It is a little bit.
Okay. So yeah, like one of our beers, the Sunday Cuddle, is approximately 10% Belgians, quadruple. And like that, I once when we were home brewing, I once filled it into a couple of 500 ml bottles, drank 2 of them, watching a game, and whew, I was like, never again am I filling that in a 500. That is, I brewed the thing, and I still I was like, whoa. Yeah. So like we would put our stronger beers into the 330 mils just to be like, look, it's stronger, so you can sip it slower. And like if you were drinking with someone else, you're in a round, but you're drinking a smaller package in the same time of a stronger beer. Just to be a little bit sensible that look, you don't want to be drinking a huge quantity. But I do get it. People are just like, would you not do it in a 500 ml? I'm just like, no, this is what we do. Like that's.
I think as well. There's, I mean, a big part of our jobs as brewers is education. And not just educating the people to the fact that there is more to beer than black, red, and gold. You know, that there's a world of styles out there, but also that beer is serious. I mean, beer to me in the Irish perception it's kind of a fizzy utility intoxicant that you drink copious quantities of till you fall over. And it could be and should be so much more. And so I would be definitely an advocate of quality over quantity. And sometimes I feel like I'm beating my head on a brick wall, and you guys probably do as well. When you're talking to somebody about a beer that you've poured your freaking heart and soul into and you've nurtured sometimes for months in wood, in stainless, you've packaged it on a small thing. And, you know, people go to craft beer taste. I go, yeah, that's the blood, sweat, and tears. But, you know, then somebody drinks and goes, it's all right, but like I couldn't have 10 pints of it. You're not fucking supposed to have 10 pints of it. What kind of a fucking caveman are you? You know, enjoy. And then they go, enjoy it. I don't know, but you're like,
No, and that's I'd absolutely agree that like that's, you know, we're only 230 liters, 220 out of an oak barrel, all brewed, everything that goes into it. And then it's just like, so I'm like, yeah, savor it and enjoy it. And the hope is that our beers have more flavor so that they slow you down and actually go, oh, and some of it, like the Liminal, I think it's a funny beer in lots of ways. But I hope that it makes people drink it and kind of go, oh, what is that? And then go, okay, how, why? And that slows you down, as opposed to, I heard a lager brewer once telling you, it's like, oh, I want that flavor that like disappears on your mouth. So you have to go back for another sup. And it's like, no, I want that you sup it and that the flavor stays in your mouth and that you can kind of go, oh, what is that? What is this experience that I'm having on a Tuesday? I have a little bit of space between kids and whatever, and I have to work tomorrow. It's like, I have a little taste of something. And what is that? And let me enjoy that experience and enjoy the work and the craft that went into making that. And I think that is important. That yeah, we're making a toxin that basically alcohol isn't good for us fundamentally, right? But it does help enjoyment and it does help relax sometimes, used sensibly and in the right manner. And that is something that I would like to try and advocate as well, is try and say, look, savor it. And I'm like, the other thing I talk about whenever people tour our brewery, basically in 2025 is the next time it'll probably be open, but it's like, I bring people around, I show them the farm, I show them the woods, I show them everything that we do, and then I bring them to the end into the barrel room basically, and it's got a cobblestone floor, and it's like, this is like, and I'm like, look, if you go to the south of France to a vineyard, you will see a similar room. There'll be oak barrels, there'll be a thing, and people will be like, this is why my wine tastes like this. And it's like, and I'll be like, people are absolutely okay with paying a shitload of money for wine, but like beer, they're like, oh no, it's cheap, we should drink lots of it. It's like, no. And I'm like, no, this is craft beer. This is different. This is artisan. And soon we'll put the year of the grain was produced on our beer to be like, no, this can be something that you can enjoy, taste, and have something different than just this bland drink that you just slug lots of it, Right. And that is something to do with being craft, and it's something, terroir. We can talk about that as well, but it's maybe specific to what I'm at. But people get it when they see the barrels and they see everything that how we're doing it. They're like, oh, I get it. This isn't just like generic beer. And I'm like, yeah, it's not. This is a different, you got to change your mindset. And that is part of the education, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
100%.
James has another question, but we won't ask him back up again. I'll spare on that. But he's just saying that we've come so far in the last 7 years, but how long until we don't need to have the same conversation about what beer can be, in your experience? Is there a section of the market that just won't ever be interested, do you think? Do you think it'll always be someone who'll just want their Guinness or their Heineken or
their hard seltzer?
Hard seltzer, Jesus, yeah.
Yeah.
Or they're non-alcoholic beers.
If you're earnestly producing something like we are, it's got the soul of the brewer in the beer. It's got a sense of terroir or provenance or what have you, whether it's from yeast, from water, from barley. It's never going to be an absolute mass market product. That's just the nature of it. But I would like to see that, and I do see it happening to some extent, that some beers in Ireland are becoming almost aspirational products without being frou-frou and without, little finger sticking out and sipping it like this. But they're beers that people are working to get their hands on, maybe limited releases. It's certainly 750ml bottles. We haven't done any yet because I can't conveniently or efficiently fill 750ml bottles. But there was a phenomenon in the States when I lived over there in the earlier days of the American craft beer revolution, or the formative years anyway, where virtually every brewery over there could have a taproom license. And I think most breweries over there survived because they had taproom licenses. And what they would do is they would build a fan base through direct interaction with their customers, people who would come to the brewery and that kind of. And this is something that up until now we have been legislatively prohibited from doing in Ireland because of the far-thinking individuals in Leinster House. There is now a license in place. You practically have to give up your house and your firstborn to get it. You can now get a license. But what the American breweries were doing was they would have a day, and there was Mike, you might know, but it was Portsmouth Brewing in New Hampshire, I think, was one of them, and I'm sure there was one out. You're Ohio, right?
Yeah, Ohio.
It was bound to be ones out there, and they would have a release day,
right?
And I think in Portsmouth in New Hampshire they had Kate the Great, which was a Russian Imperial Stout. And they released it once a year, and there was a finite amount of it available. And the night before the release, the car park was nose to tail of cars, and people were tailgate parties, and their employees were coming out, and they basically came out and they handed out tickets to the cars in order of arrival and said, "Right, you're first up to buy tomorrow, and your limit is one case," or something like that, and create this whole atmosphere of, "I'm going to buy this now because I can't get it later," and and they developed this fan base that were looking for something different. They were looking for something special. And these were beers that, you put it away somewhere and open it for the 21st or the 18th or the christening, or have it for a special occasion. Why open a bottle of fucking Prosecco that you're paying for glass and a label? The semi-rotten grape juice in the bottle isn't worth a shit, quite frankly. So why not buy something that was made down the road by somebody that you can actually meet, shake hands with, and say, there you go, there's something special for you. And you can't ever get this again because it's a single batch, it's a one-off. We will release another one next year, but it's not going to be exactly the same. And this is I'd love to see that sort of culture developing in Ireland, that people appreciate what the craft breweries are doing, and the fact that it's local, it's authentic, it's indigenous. I don't think any of us are ever going to outsource our brewing to a foreign corporation. It's just not going to happen. It's always going to be done in the community. You cannot do it anywhere else. So this is a kind of grassroots industry, and whether you're making beer, cheese, bread, pickles, whatever it may happen to be, it's kind of grassroots industry that Ireland as a nation needs to foster and support, because it's the kind of industry that's never going to go away until somebody gets successful and is purchased by a foreign corporation. Up until the advent of the existing crop of Irish craft breweries, I guess probably starting with the Carlow Brewing Company, there was not one single Irish-owned alcohol producer on the alcohol of Ireland, on the island of Ireland. Not one. Every single one of them. The household names were all foreign-owned. Divisions of foreign corporations. That's fucking wrong.
Yeah.
Not to be xenophobic or anything, but
yeah, of course.
Sorry, James and Mike.
James,
not at all, pal.
Yeah.
No, I just wanted to say.
No, I think Moss is frozen. I think you might have.
Is Moss frozen? Well, I'm where I am right now is actually not a million miles away from where Moss is. And in a different life, I was working for White Gypsy and then Middleman, and found a significant portion of the area, especially around, unfortunately, say from here down to Waterford, that was just, no matter what you said, no matter what you did, no matter how you tried to phrase it, talking about who's made it, that it's local, trying to drum up interest. Nobody cared. A lot of the time, unfortunately, it came down to price. Now, obviously, when this was going on, we were still reeling from, the crash and dealing with that. So I can understand that people's pockets were very thin at that point in time. It's just a mentality that I've seen here that is a tough thing to get across to people. I can see probably especially where Moss is at the moment, that it must be a tough sell to a lot of people in that specific area. It's just, I can't imagine, which it has been a big reason why I haven't pulled the trigger on doing things commercially here where I am, because it's just, head wrecker.
Yeah, to be honest, we're so small anyway that we're environmentally sustainable. Are we economically sustainable? That's a question that's still to be answered. Basically, that I pour my blood, sweat, and tears into it, and we'll find out sometime soon. Hopefully, we'll break even. But we have more. Well, when visiting was a thing, we'd have more people from America visiting, than Irish people. Yeah. They'd be like, "Oh my God, this is cool! I looked at your website. I really want to tour and visit and see." And I'd be like, "Yeah, cool, come visit." And that license, as in, I just remember I was in Belgium. My mother's Belgian actually, so I spent a bit of time in Belgium. And you could go up to Chimay, collect your box of bottles, drop back your old ones. And that's how you just got beer. It was like going to the butcher. You went and got beer from the brewery. And to me, that's the ultimate. And every time someone local does buy our beer or taste it and goes, "Geez, that's great," I'm win. So I'm one customer at a time. Slowly something might change, but it is tough sell.
Someday, Moss, we'll be there.
I think it's changing though. I think it is moving in the right direction. Like I think slowly over the course of the next 10 or 15 years, it'll get to that point where, people be really proud of their local brewery and things like that. But it's just going to take a while.
Yeah. Time.
And tough work, basically.
Yeah.
That I do see it. Well, like that's the thing of like marketing and getting your beer out there and stuff. Like it's such a like.
Yeah, I think the ploughing is interrupting things.
That darn tractor Wi-Fi, geez.
Well, just wait for him to go back. Listen, guys, I didn't want to hold you. I promised to try and keep it down. So I'm
an engineer by profession, and
second here now. I'm gonna.
Yeah, Moss is coming back.
Is he? Oh well, we'll wait
for Moss.
Listen, one last question before I let you go. So, all of these, even with the wild yeast and that, they are not lambic though. Lambic is very specific, just spontaneously, whatever happens to be in the air ferment. Is it? No. There, my understanding is gone.
Lambic is interesting. Lambic is the champagne of beer. Lambic has to be produced in a very, very specific geographic region to be called a lambic.
Okay.
And if you put lambic on a bottle of beer that was brewed in Sligo or Tipperary or Roscommon, you will have the lambic police down on you like a ton of Belgians. I think the geographic area, it's Brussels, but it's not even all of Brussels. It's a specific area within Brussels. And so you can do, much like the champagne, you can do a method lambic or there's a different name for it. They've established a lambic technique. Land and Labour out in Galway, Tom, he follows the lambic technique or the lambic system. I forget the correct terminology for it, but no, if it's not, it is. It's entirely spontaneous, but if you don't brew it in Brussels, it can't be called lambic.
Okay, I didn't know that, but I just wanted to at least I had part of that right. I understood the spontaneous, but I didn't understand the geographical indicator on it. Yeah. No, because I've tried. The only one I think I've tried is the Cantillon, which I found variable, but I guess that is the nature of wild spontaneous fermentation. It's some of it.
Well, that's it, and a big, huge part of lambic production is blending. Years of different ages and different sweetnesses, and that being blended together to produce a finished product. So it's a pretty complex production method, and I would imagine pretty expensive too. And at the end of the day, you probably, with experience, you're going to know what you want. But it's not something I'm that familiar with. But lambic breweries can only brew at a certain time of year because that's the time of year when the right microbes are dominant. And interestingly, I'm kind of going off on a bit of a tangent. One of the lambic brewers, possibly all of them, would agree that their brewing season is getting shorter and shorter, and they're attributing it to global warming. That they brew at a certain temperature window, if you will, and that is a fairly cold temperature window, and that temperature window is getting narrower and narrower every year.
So it could be on the way out.
Well, hopefully not.
Well, on that pressing note,
we'll revive it in Ireland. It's fucking cold enough in Roscommon.
Listen, I don't know if Morris is going to get back to us there, so I just said thanks. Listen, I really enjoyed this. I thought it was very, very entertaining, very great, very informative. Learned a lot, and I don't know. Hopefully, you enjoyed it.
Yeah, and I had a great time. I appreciate it.
Brilliant. So look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play out this thing, just show people what's on next week. And if you hang on there for a second, if I can figure out where this thing is. This is so next week we're going to have hopefully blacks and someone, I can't remember who the last person is, but I'll show them on a video here. And who is it?